How long, O Lord? O Lord, how long? How long will the violence last? How long will chaos dominate the news? How long will communities across the U.S., including Charlotte, be plagued by death, rioting, and destruction? How long, O Lord? We live in a time of many chasms. Whole minority populations view police officers across a chasm of distrust as black men across this country are shot and killed. Refugees peer across a chasm of hate and xenophobia as they flee a war-torn country in fear for their lives. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people cower on their side of a chasm as they are victims of violence and inequality. Democrats and Republicans back further and further away from one another, allowing the chasm between them to widen and widen while disadvantaged people in this country fall through the cracks. Black Lives Matter, patriots, athletes, the rich, the poor, religious and atheist, we all seem surrounded by chasms. In life, the divide between the rich man and Lazarus, as Jesus tells this parable, is the gate of the rich man's home. Perhaps the rich man doesn't know that Lazarus is there. Perhaps he knows and does nothing. Perhaps the rich man has helped before, but not enough. Regardless, the next scene portrays a wide chasm between these two characters, a barrier that is insurmountable. The rich man begs for aid, but the chasm is too formidable. The rich man begs for warnings to be sent to his family that they might avoid his fate. But Abraham tells him that if they are unable to obey Moses and the prophets, they will not be affected by a man rising from the dead, an obvious reference to Jesus Christ. In Deuteronomy, Moses says, "Do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor." The prophet Isaiah wrote, "Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and not to hide yourself from your own kin?" According to Moses and the prophets, the way to avoid the chasm is to bridge the divide. The way to bridge the divide is to reach out and care for another. This is not a helpful suggestion. This is a biblical imperative, not only from Moses and the prophets, but from Jesus' entire ministry as well. Love your neighbor as yourself. There are so many divides in this world, so many chasms, that it would be impossible to address them all. But the chasm that seems so broad right now, the chasm that seems to be opening instead of closing, is the chasm that divides races. This is a flashpoint in our world. From everyday inequality to overt and shocking acts of racism to disheartening statistics, racism is still a plague in America. I listened recently to an episode of the program This American Life. The program was called "The Problem We All Live With." Nicole Hannah-Jones is a reporter who spent many years reporting on struggling school districts. She noticed that many of these districts were doing the same things to try to fix their failing schools. A great magnet program, a focus on literacy, or an early college high school. She found that these solutions never worked. The bad schools just couldn't catch up, and these struggling schools were predominantly minority schools. Hannah-Jones found one thing that would cut the achievement gap between white and black students, and that was integration. Between 1971 and 1988, in the peak years of integration, black students across the country went from performing 40% worse to just 18% worse in only 17 years. Integration made students of all races perform better. Normandy High School is just outside of St. Louis, in a predominantly black district, a failing school that lost its accreditation. It lost its accreditation due to lack of resources, due to rising dropout rates, due to falling test scores. By law in Missouri, if a school becomes unaccredited, the school district is required to provide transportation to another nearby high school. Black students prepared to be essentially integrated into nearby Francis Howell High School, a district that was 85% white. But they were not exactly met with open arms. Officials at Francis Howell held a town hall meeting about being forced to include these students into their school. The place was packed with primarily white locals. Person after person loudly voiced fears about the inclusion of these students. Person after person implied heavily that these students were destined to destroy their school. One parent claimed that these students were being forced out of their school because they were violent. This, of course, was not the reason Normandy lost its accreditation. Finally, the parents blatantly threatened to move their children out of the district to private schools. This white flight often happened during peak integration, which resulted in the failure of the initial intent. By fleeing the schools, white families fulfilled their own prophecies because the positive effects of integration were never realized. This is, strangely enough, not a story from the mid-1960s when schools were forced to integrate. This is a story from 3 years ago, in the school district where Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri. The process of desegregation was by no means easy. After the U.S. Supreme Court called for desegregation in 1954, it took school districts many years to implement the program, and some only did so because they were forced to by the Civil Rights Act. It was not until 1965 that the Albemarle school system implemented its initial integration measures. Even after the city of Albemarle was desegregated, white students tried to move schools to avoid desegregation. And 35 years down the road, how are we doing? Just to have one idea, one of the goals of desegregation was to decrease the variance of minority percentages. Many schools had a difference of 20% or more between district-wide rates. So, for example, if the district minority population was 30%, the white schools might only have 10% minority representation, while black schools might have over 50% representation, resulting in effectively segregated schools. In 2015, the entire Stanley County School District had a minority population of 27%. Stanley County's elementary schools tell the story. The county schools, while low in minority representation, fall within that 20% difference, with some schools below it, ND at 13%, Locust at 15%, and Richfield at 15%. And some schools hover right around the district average, Oakboro at 25%, Norwood 24%, and Baden at 32%. Yet the two schools located most centrally in the downtown area show us the divide which still exists. Central Elementary School is at 53%, 26% higher than the district. East Albemarle is at 66%, 39% higher than the district-wide percentage. Similar numbers exist between the county and city high schools. These numbers paint a picture of a county that continues to be racially segregated. Brown versus Board of Education happened 62 years ago, and cities and towns throughout the South are still struggling to follow the spirit of that law. If Nicole Hannah-Jones' research is to be believed, the story of Lazarus can help our education system. Jesus' parable teaches us that the tenuous barriers we refuse to cross become the chasms that separate us from one another. Perhaps the barrier of race in our education system, in our schools, is the barrier that we must cross to prevent the chasm. That is not easy by any means. Busing is a difficult prospect. Racial tension is a reality, one about which we must be honest. Convenience for an individual often outweighs the benefits for the entire system. Crossing the barriers in our school system and in other aspects of our lives presents many challenges. But since when has doing the right thing always meant doing the easiest thing? We have an opportunity to close the chasm, to create a country where white children and black children succeed alongside one another, and the divides that have characterized our reality for so many generations can dissolve. The violence we've seen around our country over the past 3 to 4 years, the violence we've seen in Charlotte over the past week, these acts of death and destruction are symptomatic of a country of people who are divided from one another, who don't know, trust, or understand one another, and quite frankly, often avoid attempting to do so. This has been most clearly true in the response to the movement called Black Lives Matter. This movement has attempted to voice frustrations with, raise concerns about, and dismantle a system of white privilege. However you feel about the movement, consider their role in the world. This movement has met so much blowback, most notably counter cries of all lives matter. As Christians, we do affirm that all lives matter, but that is not what this conversation is about. I remember sitting in the auditorium during Montreat this past summer, and a young man with some form of mental or physical disability came to the podium and led part of the liturgy. After he finished leading, the congregation applauded him as he left the stage, in a way that they had not applauded any of the other leaders. I overheard someone near me who commented, "We say that we want to be people who are treated equally. That doesn't seem like equal treatment to me." It may not have been equal treatment, but it was a moment of creating equality. This was a moment when someone who struggles against an able-bodied and an able-minded status quo reached across the chasm and was met by those on the other side. Bringing that person to a place of equality, bridging that chasm, does not mean treating him exactly the way we would treat anyone else. It means helping to lift him up. It means altering the status quo. This is what the civil rights movement of the 1960s was about, recognizing that the status quo allowed there to be a chasm, and that the only way to close the chasm was by creating equality where it didn't exist, by lifting up those who the system, the world, and the status quo had disadvantaged. This is what the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to do. They're not saying that all lives do not matter. They are saying that black people have, for centuries, been victims of discrimination, violence, and indeed the status quo. We must recognize this. We must not ignore it. We must find a way to focus on and lift up those who have been pushed aside. Privilege is a tricky thing. The rich man in Jesus' parable is not described as having done anything particularly vile. A recent article in Sojourner magazine addresses white privilege. It says, society confers unearned gifts on people who embody particular privileged traits while neglecting to confer them on others. This isn't to say that people who embody more privilege are explicitly homophobic, racist, ableist, classist, or sexist. End quote. This distinction is important. Just because the rich man in Jesus' parable was rich didn't mean that he was necessarily bigoted, biased, or prejudiced. But the barrier existed between him and Lazarus nonetheless. Because the rich man didn't actively cross the barrier, the chasm formed. The obstacle became impossible to cross. Being a Christian means being called to act to close the chasm by engaging with the disenfranchised. This is the call to those of us who are favored by the status quo. Myself above all others as a white, straight Protestant man. The advocacy and engagement by people of power, in this example, white people, is how change happens. It seems to me that in every major social change, there is a joint effort made by people who are oppressed and members of the group who are in power who are willing to be their allies. Only when these two groups of people are able to pull together their effort can change actually happen. In the same most recent publication of Sojourners, there is an article about how policing might change to help solve racial problems, which are manifested when young men are shot and killed and riots begin. In communities around the country, police departments are trying something called community policing. Police are integrated into the community. They live in that community. They participate in the community activities. They walk the streets for their entire first year and create relationships. When someone calls the police, the person that shows up is not a stranger in a blue uniform. He or she is a member of that community who knows and cares about its residents. Community policing is an example of crossing the barrier, of closing the chasm. Steps like this to reach out and engage make such a big difference in creating a community of trust. These steps take courage and conviction. These steps take initiative where none is required. These steps take grace. This grace is the gift that Jesus gives us. This is the hope, the only hope for our world, the grace of Jesus Christ. Jesus calls us in the parable today to close the chasm that forms between people by reaching across the barriers between people before they become impassable. You've heard many words from me this morning. Some may have made you feel hopeful. Some may have made you feel awkward. Some may have even made you feel defensive or angry, and that's okay. But I hope that they have made you feel something, because it is only by caring that anything can change. It is only by talking about this, by having these conversations, by resolving to do something, that anything can change. You've heard me speak many words, but I defer my final words to someone who is much better at writing them and who knows much better what she is talking about. This poem is called Human Family by Maya Angelou. I note the obvious differences in the human family. Some of us are serious, some thrive on comedy. Some declare their lives are lived as true profundity, and others claim they really live the real reality. The variety of skin tones can confuse, bemuse, delight. Brown and pink and beige and purple, tan and blue and white. I've sailed upon the 7 seas, I've stopped in every land. I've seen the wonders of the world, not yet one common man. I know 10,000 women called Jane or Mary Jane, but I've not seen any two who really were the same. Mirror twins are different, although their features jibe, and lovers think quite different thoughts while lying side by side. We love and lose in China, we weep on England's moors. We laugh and moan in Guinea and thrive on Spanish shores. We seek success in Finland, are born and die in Maine. In minor ways, we're different. In major, we're the same. I note the obvious differences between each sort and type, but we are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. Amen.